let's go to the Dragon's Tail in between North Carolina and Tennessee, in Robinson, a little town just inside of North Carolina. And let's pretend we're trying to go in and out of those turns as fast as possible. What kind of car would you pick to go in and out of those turns? Does anybody here have a car they would pick? Anybody want to participate? A BMW. Ooh, a 3 Series or a 5? A 6. Oh, I like the way you think. Anybody else have a car in mind? A Subaru. Yes. Made with love. A Lamborghini. Yes. Well, I want to talk to you today a little bit about EQ and IQ and how they work together. And I want to think of EQ and IQ as car and driver. How many of you, when you were picturing yourself going down those roads, were picturing the driver? Very few of you. Probably picturing the speedometer, maybe the kind of tires you see whizzing by. But the actual driver is just as important as the car. Because you can take a race car driver who's trained and professionally ready to drive a car, and you can put them inside of a Yugo, and they'll outperform all of us, right? So today we're going to talk just a little bit about how, I don't think this is working. There it is. We're going to talk a little bit about the mind. The mind is a very powerful tool. 1,000 neurons moving per second, hundreds of thousands of neurons exchanging hundreds of thousands of electrical pieces of information. And today we're going to talk about how EQ and IQ work together. So the first question I want to ask you is, what is IQ? Your IQ is your intelligence quotient. And there's different ways that we measure your intelligence quotient. Intelligence quotient's a big, fancy word for how well you recall and relay information. Your IQ is your ability to measure things spatially. It's your ability to do things verbally and written. It's your ability to be able to manipulate and recall information. But many of you might have a very high IQ. You can recall information. But I want to call to your attention how you're using that information. Your IQ is, in some sense, your chosen fast car. So I want to talk to you a little bit about how we use that car today, how that car works together with the driver, and talk about how your emotional intelligence and your intellect work together hand in hand. We measure intelligence starting out in grade school with iStep and iRead. I have 4 daughters going through the grade school system here in Valparaiso, and they're already measuring them against their peers. We are measured from day one on how quickly we can recall information, how quickly we can pursue thought and then use that thought and come into action. And then we go into college and we do things like the ACT, SAT, and the MCAT test to further compare ourselves to people. But do you know how much of a relationship your MCAT, your ACT, and your ACT has to your higher ability? When they did research, they found out that there is 0% of the relationship between your IQ and your higher ability. So let's talk a little bit more about IQ, just so we understand it fully. Okay, some of the key factors are your genetics and your environment. We find that people that go to school when they're younger, when they're brought up to read, or they're brought up with their ABCs even as an infant, when they're given those basic life skills starting out, then they're more likely to succeed when they get older. And I'm a product of that environment. I'm actually a high school dropout, believe it or not. And I started out very young. It wasn't a big valuable thing in my family for us to read or hang out and get to know the ABCs. We were into fast cars. But I found out later in life that it's all about how much information that you can store, recall, and place in the room. There's also key factors like genetics. I did a little bit of research that found in the McGill and the Stacey research that I did that found that you can actually prove that a child that was breastfed is actually more likely to have a higher intelligence just because they're fed the right nutrients, their brain is chemically and physically less challenged in the developmental years, therefore their intelligence seems to go up. A high IQ is basically your precision, your efficiency, your accuracy, and your multitask ability. But I think there's a lot more to being helpful and useful in today's society than just having a high IQ. And I also happen to serve as an engineer and a pastor, so I can tell you I've worked with people with very high IQ and very high EQ, and it seems to me that when you marry the two, it's the perfect storm. So let's talk about what EQ means. It has nothing to do with your gender, by the way. The research that I found that men and women both share the equal ability to develop their EQ. It's how you fit into the room. It's how you take the room on as a human being and ask questions and inspire questions from other people around you. Despite your intelligence, if you're able to read the room and see where the information that you carry fits in for the greater good, thus your EQ gets higher and higher and higher. And it's actually something that you can develop. Your emotional quotient is much like learning to drive a car. Now, your first time you get in that nice 6 Series Beamer, I'm sure you'll do okay at taking the turns, but I would bet that after years of practice, learning how the car reacts to certain turns, learning how to maneuver, learning what's best for the car's operating temperature, then you learn how to use the car to its fullest potential. So why is EQ so important? I did a lot of research about EQ, and I found that the team skills were 35 to 45% of the reason why people would hire you. So they would go through and they would make sure you had the necessary qualifications to meet a job, but then they wanted to know how you would be able to complete that job and work alongside of others. And when I was interviewed at Kendall Electric, I was actually selected because I had a higher EQ than the engineer who went to a 4-year engineering school. And they just said that the information that I had was more applicable and that they felt that I could work together with them as a team. So it's not always about who has the most smarts. Sometimes it's about what you do with those smarts. Another thing I'd like to draw to your attention about EQ is that you're going to have a better work performance. We found 50 to 60% better work performance with someone who had a higher EQ. We found that they had a longer mental stamina. They were able to see that a problem had come up, and they were able to forecast how that problem might end before it actually ended, thus putting themselves in a better position throughout that situation to make themselves succeed. Also, we saw that people had more well-rounded relationships. People with a high EQ had a much lower divorce rate. And I know those of us who are married would love to say we'd like to develop our EQ a little better, right? Take out the trash when it's appropriate, or say your yeses and your nos, or say, I'm wrong. So another thing about EQ that I thought was interesting is that it can be trained. I found this out in my own personal life. I grew up with a very low EQ. I didn't know how to fit in, and I had trouble kind of capturing the room and getting people to give me positive attention. And what I had learned in college is if you look at someone else's vantage point and you treat them with respect, then they're going to treat you with that same respect. Respect is a very sticky thing. And the high EQ lets you know that the more respectable you treat someone, the more respectable you would expect they would treat you back. So a couple ways you can train your EQ, and I thought this was pretty interesting as well. You can get some coaching, get a mentor. So if you want to see how you can fit in better, well, ask people how you fit in now. The engineers that I work with every day, and they're great people, many of them have trouble figuring out where they fit in the room right now. And I asked my boss, and we're about a 5,000 member company at Kendall Electric. I asked my boss, how do you determine what kind of engineers you want to hire? He said, it's a very simple answer, the kind of engineers that want to hire us, the ones that want to be a part of our team, the ones that come pursuing the same values that we have, the people that can translate to us what our mission and what our values are. I said, well, don't you want to make sure you have the smartest engineers in the group? He said, I'll take the most emotionally intelligent engineers in the room because every engineer can solve problems. They're trained to solve problems when they're in college, but not every engineer can work with other people who they feel are less superior in knowledge. And so it's really important not to just gain knowledge, but to understand emotionally how we fit into the room. So again, I want to ask you, when I asked you your favorite car, when you were picturing yourself driving down the road, were you picturing exactly how that person would be turning and exactly which way the car would be going and exactly how fast it would be going you weren't picturing any of that. You were just picturing that nice, fast car. And when people think of an intelligence quotient, that's what we think of. I want to be able to recall information quickly. But when we marry that with an emotional quotient, we begin to see that not only is the information that we have very important, but also how we use that information to better society, to better the room we're in. So a couple of things that are important about developing a good EQ is setting emotional, spiritual, and even physical boundaries. And when we looked at the top-level CEOs and CFOs of the major companies that we had studied, including Allstate, Geico, a few other insurance companies, we also looked at some of, like Procter & Gamble. They all had a very high emotional quotient, and successful people were shown to have 79% more self-awareness. I thought that was pretty staggering. So that leaves us wondering, am I emotionally ready or am I intelligent enough to meet the workforce needs that are out there today? I say you have to look at both. You have to look at the information that's required to have your job. You can't just go be a nurse without going to nursing school. You can't be a doctor without studying and taking the MCAT and passing the exams. I understand. But equally important when you go to see that doctor, to see that nurse, is how they treat you at the bedside table. Have any of you ever been hurt and been in the doctor's office? It's a very scary thing. I went in to get my knee taken care of as a kid. I'd cut my knee open really terribly, and I went and I can still remember how the doctor treated me. He was not only smart enough to fix my problem, but he was emotionally intelligent enough to hold my hand and say, look, son, it's going to be okay. What kind of organization do you want to work for? A place that gathers smart people, or a place that gathers people that want to work together to be as smart as everyone can together? So yes, it is your emotional quotient and your intelligence quotient. Both can be measured, both can be grown, both can be developed. I want to encourage you to go out there and grow and develop your EQ and your IQ.